Now that you've completed part 2 of the digestive system, you're able to describe the structure and function of the mouth, teeth, larynx, esophagus, and the stomach, including the sphincters. Looking at the upper portion of those items, the teeth, tongue, and so on, we can talk about the process of swallowing. As you chew your food, breaking it down into smaller and smaller bits mechanically, and your tongue moves the food around within the mouth to mix in the saliva to help break down the food chemically. Eventually what will happen is we'll need to move the food back into the larynx and then down the esophagus. At the same time, the pharynx is attached, as we can see here, to the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx, and then to the respiratory system at the laryngopharynx. In order to direct the food down the esophagus, a few steps have to take place. During swallowing, the soft palate moves towards the opening to the nasopharynx, thus closing it off, not allowing food to move up into the nasal cavity. Similarly, the laryngeal opening is closed because as you swallow, the trachea moves upwards, allowing the epiglottis to cover over the glottis, which is where you find the vocal cords within the respiratory passage, but also allows air to move down into the trachea. Epi refers to above, and glottis is referring to glottis, this opening within the trachea. And so the epiglottis, as you swallow, moves down and covers over or above the glottis, forcing food to move over it down into the esophagus and then down into the stomach. The presence of food in the esophagus stimulates peristaltic activity. This is flexion of the muscle layer that we'll look at in a moment here within the esophagus. Glands within the mucosa of the esophagus also secrete mucus, which helps to lubricate the food, or the bolus, this ball of food, that is passing along the esophagus and being moved via these peristaltic motions. If we were to take a look at any point along the digestive tract, we would see this, that it's made up of multiple layers. In the middle, we actually have what's called the lumen. This is actually the location that the food is traveling along as it undergoes the digestive processes. The inner layer, just around the lumen, is the mucosa layer. Within the mucosa, we have an epithelial layer along the innermost portion, and then we have lymphatic tissue to help to deal with any pathogens, bacteria, viruses that might actually be getting into our body through our food. We have the submucosa layer. Sub in this case is referring to below, just underneath the mucosa layer. It contains glands. So the pink items shown here are the glands in the submucosa. And then here's a duct from the gland indicated there. These glands will be secreting digestive enzymes, some of which we will look at here in a few moments. We then have the muscle layer, which is made up of two layers of muscle. The circular muscle layer, which wraps around the digestive tract, and then the longitudinal muscle layer, which runs up and down the muscular layer. Peristalsis is actually produced within this muscle layer, these two muscle layers. As the circular muscle contracts, it squeezes to make the lumen smaller. As the longitudinal muscle layer contracts, it actually moves that contracted portion of the circular muscle along the digestive tract, thus sort of milking the food through the lumen of the digestive tract. The outermost layer is the serosa layer. The serosa extends as part of the peritoneal membranes. The peritoneal membranes are the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum making up the serosa that we're showing here, wrapping around the organs itself. The parietal peritoneum, as we saw with pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity, the parietal peritoneum actually lines the inside of the abdominal cavity where we find the small intestine, the large intestines. Within these layers, traveling through the serosa to the muscle layer and then to the submucosa layer, we have nerves. Within the serosa and then traveling to the muscle layer and the submucosa layer, we also have blood vessels, because ultimately each of these tissues requires oxygen and nutrients, as well as we will be picking up nutrients from the digested food, absorbing them into these blood vessels to then travel around the body. In some areas, the serosa layer forms the mesentery. These peritoneal membranes located behind digestive organs, and what they do are connective tissue that helps to surround and protect the intestines, but also connect the intestines in order to hold them up so that the intestines are not within the abdominal cavity all collapsed on each other, but are held in some semblance of order within the abdominal cavity. While I've mentioned the intestine in the last few minutes here, I want to re-emphasize that these 4 layers make up the entire GI tract. So whether we're talking about intestine or stomach or esophagus, etc., the GI tract is made up of these 4 layers. Let's move on and define chime, and we'll see how those 4 layers exist in the different parts of the GI tract. Let's start by taking a look at the stomach. We can see in the image here that the esophagus connects to the stomach at the lower esophageal sphincter. This sphincter plays a role in preventing reflux from the stomach. Once food moves down to the stomach, we don't want food to come back up. We call that vomiting. And so the lower esophageal sphincter, under normal circumstances, once food is down in the stomach, tightens to prevent backflow of food. We can see here that the stomach is actually made up of 3 major regions: the fundus, the body, and the pylorus region. Within the stomach, there's a ripple layer here that is made up of the rugae. The reason for these ripples is because as we fill our stomach with food, we want the stomach to have the ability to expand a little bit. At the bottom portion of the stomach, in the pylorus, you can see a second sphincter, the pyloric sphincter. This prevents the food from moving too quickly through the stomach into the small intestine, the beginning of which, as you can see here, is called the duodenum. And so once we swallow food and it travels down the esophagus into the stomach, it's actually held there. And what happens is we have a few different types of cells here within the various layers that we mentioned in the previous slide. So we have the mucous membrane, which when we zoom in on it has mucus cells that secrete lubricating materials in order to allow the food to glide along the surface of the stomach. We also have parietal cells, which release hydrochloric acid as well as the chemical intrinsic factor. Then we have chief cells, which release digestive enzymes that break down materials within the food, and we'll take a closer look at those in a later slide. All of these 3 types of cells start releasing these chemicals as soon as food comes down into the stomach. But beyond the mucous membrane, we have the submucosa, and then we have the muscular layers. And so once the food is down in the stomach, there are chemicals released to chemically digest the food, but the muscle layers of the stomach will also start flexing in order to mix the chemicals into the food to break down the chemicals that the food is made up of. These muscle layers are similar to the layers that we mentioned earlier throughout the GI tract, except there's actually one extra layer. We have the circular muscle layer that wraps around the stomach, the longitudinal muscle layer that runs up and down the stomach, but then we have an oblique muscle layer that runs at an angle to each of those other 2 layers. In this way, as all the muscle layers contract, again, they're mixing the chemicals, the digestive enzymes, the hydrochloric acid, etc., into the food in order to start the process of breaking that food down. Once that food is starting to break down and is sort of mushy, if you will, with the mucus and the various chemicals that make up the factors released by the stomach, we now consider this chime, and the chime moves through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine to continue the digestive process. The small intestine has 3 major regions. The first, as we saw in the previous slide, is the duodenum. The second region is called the jejunum, and the final, the ileum. Zooming in a little bit, we can see where the stomach actually attaches to the duodenum, this initial portion of the small intestine. Just after the stomach connects to the duodenum, We have a region here where the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas actually connect to the small intestine. They can then release their digestive enzymes and other chemicals into the small intestine in order to help the digestive process, because as mentioned earlier, these are accessory organs. We'll take a closer look at these accessory organs in just a few minutes in order to discuss what processes they cause to occur. But it's important to note that they attach just after the stomach in order to release their digestive enzymes and other chemicals into the chime that has recently come out of the stomach. Now let's take a closer look at the small intestine itself and specifically talk about the role that the villi play in digestion. If we take a close look at this region here, we can see all the layers that we mentioned earlier, the mucosa layer, submucosa, and then the muscle layer. Within the intestine, though, we have folds of the intestinal wall, as indicated here. And on those folds, we actually have villi. If we were to zoom into the region indicated by the rectangle here, we could take a close-up look at the villi. Within each villi along the surface, we have a lacteal. The lacteal is the beginning of a lymphatic capillary. We also have arteries and veins that form capillary networks within the villi. The reason that we have the lacteals and then the arteries and the veins and the capillary network is that the reason that we have the folds and then the villi is that this increases the surface area of the intestine in order to allow for absorption of nutrients from our food. On top of that, those nutrients go either into the lacteal, the lymphatic system, or into the blood capillaries to then transport those nutrients around the body. On the surface of the villi, and it's hard to see in this image here, but we actually have microvilli, little hair-like extensions off of the cells that make up the surface. And so we have actually even more surface area to allow for movements of nutrients from our food to absorb into those capillaries and the lacteal. We'll talk a little bit more about which nutrients move into the lacteal versus which nutrients move into the capillary network in a few moments when we look at the overall breakdown of the different types of food that we bring in to this digestive system. Now let's look at the large intestine. The small intestine attaches to the large intestine at the cecum. Off the tip of the cecum is the appendix. So when you hear of people, or if perhaps you've had your appendix removed, this is what we're talking about here. This is a region where there's lots of lacteals and can often pick up infections and get swollen and cause issues, and it can be removed through surgical intervention with little effect overall on a patient's health. From the cecum, the food moves up along the ascending colon. At the hepatic fixture, hepatic referring to the liver, and so the turn of the large intestine where the liver is, the colon then travels along the transverse colon, moving along the transverse plane across the body. The colon then turns again, forming the descending colon. We then have a region called the sigmoid colon. The sigmoid shape is an S shape, and what you can see here is that the large intestine undergoes a little S-shaped curve before it reaches to the rectum, and then as we mentioned earlier in this slide presentation, the rectum is connected to the anal canal, which connects to the outside of the body. We also have these puckering bulges in the large intestine that help to increase the surface area of the large intestine. Ultimately, the functions of the large intestines are absorption of water and electrolytes, things like sodium and potassium, the synthesis of certain vitamins by bacteria that are actually found under natural conditions within the large intestine, specifically vitamin K and some B vitamins. They also provide temporary storage of waste, feces, and then also allow for the elimination of waste from the body through the process of defecation.